So what do you think happened that day on the mountaintop? That day when Peter and James and John experienced that one brief shining moment that we know as the transfiguration of Jesus. I have never been one to shy away from challenging lectionary texts, but I have to admit that the transfiguration story always gives me pause. There it is, year after year, the last Sunday of a joyful Epiphany season, the season of Emmanuel, or God with us. It is the Sunday before Ash Wednesday when we stumble and tumble into Lent. It moves us around the corner into the more somber and reflective aspects of these 40 days leading up to Easter. It is such a curious story on so many levels. I don't know about you, but that magical, mystical mountaintop moments like this are beyond my experience, especially those that include blinding light and voices, not to mention dead people of the notoriety of Moses and Elijah. Maybe I have a hard time with the Transfiguration story because I don't know quite what to do with it. I keep trying to read behind the text to find some way to connect it to my experience of God, but I can't. I have no doubt that I would be just like Peter, reacting in the most practical way possible, offering to build shelters or booths for Jesus and Moses and Elijah to stay in. The mystery of it all is more than I can get my logical mind around, and the only thing I can think of is trying to get my hands on it, trying somehow to hold on to what I can't comprehend. The comfort in that is that there are times when I don't know isn't bad theology. Speaking of which, I remember a story that John Buchanan told about the letter he received from the middle school kids when he was pastor at Fourth Presbyterian in Chicago. It read, "We have some questions about Christmas. 1, did the star stand still? 2, were the shepherds and the wise men real? 3, how was Jesus born if his parents didn't have sexual intercourse? Please meet us next Sunday and tell us the answers to our questions. Merry Christmas," signed the 6th and 7th grade church school class. Buchanan said his first response was that back in the dark ages when he was in 6th grade, the phrase sexual intercourse had not been uttered aloud in his hearing, and for certain it was not a phrase you would use in a note to your minister. He said his second response was that nobody ever tells you, nor is it taught in seminary, that you will become the court of appeals for questions nobody else wants to answer. As in, that's a great question, why don't you ask your Sunday school teacher? Which then usually becomes, that's a great question, let's ask the pastor. Nevertheless, he met the kids the following week and said that he learned once again a fundamental lesson of theological discourse. And that is that I don't know is a legitimate and respectable answer to some questions. So if you ask me to tell you what happened on that mountaintop, I would probably say, I don't know. Buchanan went on to say that he discovered a wonderful thing about 6th and 7th graders, which is that they are quite capable of handling the fact that there are some things we do not and may never understand, and that there are probably more important questions about those things, like what does it mean, or what is it saying to us? Most of us bring a healthy skepticism and lots of questions to reports of things that supposedly cannot be explained rationally or scientifically, things that don't need those more in-depth questions, even the silliest, simplest ones that we all scoff at, which probably don't deserve much of our attention but get it anyway, at least for a while. One of my favorites was the report of the face of the Virgin Mary in a grilled cheese sandwich. You may remember that one. It was sold on eBay, as I recall, for several $1,000s. Or people who report seeing the face of Jesus on the ceiling tiles of their bedroom and begin to hold prayer meetings there. Perhaps because it seems so far-fetched, we often decide that it really is simply a badly burned grilled cheese sandwich or a watermark from a leaky roof, and we discount it as being another crackpot vision that somebody had. But events like the Transfiguration really challenge our sensibilities. It doesn't match our experience of God, and we can't explain it away. Now, there's no way that we can begin to think about the Transfiguration as a factual account of an historical moment. But as one of my favorite preachers and writers reminds us, we are not concerned with historicity here. We are concerned with epiphany, which ordinary time and space cannot contain. This is a moment, like so much of Scripture, that has to be seen with the eyes of the heart. So let's imagine what it might have been like. Let's look at that one brief shining moment with the eyes of our hearts and try to get beyond the skepticism, our unbelief, beyond our sensibilities that tell us that moments like this don't really happen. Jesus takes Peter and James and John up on the mountain with him to pray. A few weeks ago, we were going down to the river to pray with the youth choir. This morning, we're going up to the mountain to pray with Shine, Jesus, Shine. The mountain, you remember, is where God is often encountered. So right there, we've got a pretty good idea that something incredible is going to happen once they get up there. If the disciples had any inkling of what was coming next, they didn't let on. But then perceptiveness was never one of their strong suits, so we shouldn't be surprised that they were exhausted, weighed down with sleep, wanting nothing more than to lie down with a quick nap while Jesus prays. But they are wide awake when Jesus is suddenly and inexplicably transformed. We are told by Luke that the appearance of his face changed, and his clothing became dazzling white. And if that weren't enough, the disciples watch in silence as Moses and Elijah join the scene and begin talking with Jesus. This Hollywood moment only gets better when Peter says, "I've got a great idea. Let's build shelters for all of you, and we can just stay up here forever." The words are barely out of his mouth when they are all engulfed by a cloud, and the voice of God booms out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And then it's over. Now, if you were one of those disciples, right about now, wouldn't you be saying, "What just happened here?" Contemporary images of transfiguration are sometimes hard to come by, although maybe some of you could share yours. Derek and I jokingly recall a moment at our house when we gave our cat Banjo credit for an epiphany moment. Banjo was the oldest cat in town when Derek thought he wasn't long for this world, and he decided it was time for us to get an overlapping cat. Betty came into our lives. Betty was a little high-strung, which is an understatement, and Banjo wasn't really very nice to her when she arrived, so she was always looking over her shoulder, except on this one particular evening when she was just sitting there, washing her face, minding her own business, not paying a whole lot of attention when Banjo apparently decided to get to know her better. He crept up behind her, and his nose barely touched her backside when she went straight up in the air, about 3 feet, did a complete 180, and tore down the stairs. You could almost see the blinding lights. We didn't see her again for several hours. And Banjo looked at us like, "What just happened here?" Seriously, though, it's probably safe to say that few of us, perhaps none of us, has experienced the kind of epiphany complete with dazzling lights and clouds and the voice of God that happened on that mountaintop. We tend to think of transfiguration more simply as change or transformation. And because no change ever comes without some struggle or pain or loss or separation, we are reluctant to embrace it. I can't walk past our church nursery if there's an unhappy child in there without remembering the first time I left one of mine in the church nursery and headed up to the sanctuary with his screams ringing in my ears. Separation anxiety, they told me. He'll stop once you're out of sight. You might imagine that was cold comfort to a new mother. Or walking out of a parent's home and closing the door for the last time, as many of us have already done. When that was my job, almost 7 years ago now, I didn't imagine that I would have growing pains at my age. I'm convinced that we have emotional growing pains too, and they usually afflict us when we're going through something that causes a radical change in our lives. How much easier it would be to hold on to what's familiar, to cling to what we know, whether it's a crying baby or a house full of memories. We're a little like Peter, who in his confusion and his fear just wants to hold on to what he loves most. We want to hold on to whatever gives us our identity and our security. We want to do whatever we can to avoid the emotional growing pains. Congregations are no different. I've done this long enough to know that walking with a congregation through change can be hard and painful work. especially if the conversation turns to the kind of changes that will bring about greater health and wholeness, changes that may come at a cost that we can't yet anticipate. The temptation is to hold on to what is familiar, to rely on what we already know, to resist change because we have always done it that way, which, as you may know, are sometimes called the 7 last words of the church. We have always done it that way. So back to that mountaintop moment. Jesus was transfigured. He was somehow changed. But Jesus didn't become a different person. It wasn't abracadabra, alakazam, and he was somebody else. When all was said and done, and the blinding lights and the clouds were gone, the same Jesus who went up the mountain to pray was still standing there. So maybe we shouldn't always assume that transformation into something radically different is part of the deal. One commentator talked about transfiguration this way, which resonated with me, perhaps it will with you as well. He wrote, "When a thing changes, there is the suggestion that it is no longer itself. A thing transfigured is more fully itself than ever, and more irradiated with beauty." Think about that. More fully itself than ever. Transfigured, we may indeed be changed, but more significantly, we are more fully ourselves than ever before. We are reminded that these mountaintop moments are gifts, because when it's over, we still have to come back down and go to work. If we build a shelter for them, or erect a frame around them and enshrine them, we can end up worshiping those moments or memories or people to the extent that they become a hindrance or a stumbling block rather than a gift. Better that we understand transfiguration as the moment when we become whole and complete in ourselves, when we become more fully who we are, who we were meant to be, so that when we're back to sea level, we become the gift for others. That's one of the singular and unique characteristics of a community like McAllister Plymouth. Indeed, any faith community that tends to stand on the leading edge of social justice issues or even controversy. Being part of this kind of community challenges us to become more fully who we are meant to be. And it comes with the same word of caution. We must hold the moments and the memories and the experiences of our past very lightly, lest they become a stumbling block to what lies down the road or just around the corner. We always have choices about how to respond to the mountaintop transfiguration moments in our lives. We can strangle them with if-onlys. If only I could stay here longer, if only things would never change, if only I could relive that experience. We can reminisce about our experiences, telling and retelling stories of the glory days until we manage to get stuck or even lost somewhere in the past. Or we can allow them to prepare us for what God calls us to do next. We can open ourselves to transfiguration. As we move into Lent, may we be transfigured. May we take those brief, shining moments with us into the world to feed and clothe, teach and love and heal and serve. May we be more fully ourselves than ever before, more irradiated with the beauty of God's amazing grace. Amen.